All right, we are joined by Dr. Michael Ginn. He's a scientist, journalist, and a best-selling author. He's the first correspondent ever to report from the wreck of the Titanic and had faced a similar terrifying situation underwater. Dr. Ginn, thank you so much for joining us. News that no one really wanted to hear. But first of all, I want to get your reaction to that tragic news that's really tied to the ship that you reported on and had a similar experience back in 2000.
Yes, Julie, Steve, good evening. It is the news no one wanted to hear, but it's also the news that, frankly, is consistent with everything we heard all along. From day one, I was saying that it was a catastrophic flight failure for a variety of reasons, and here we are. It's going to be very interesting, and I think it's important that they were able to locate the vessel because now we can piece the shrapnel together like a puzzle and figure out exactly where did this pressure vessel fail, why did it fail, perhaps there was a microfracture caused by previous dives that this made to the Titanic. We just won't know. But I recall when the U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, the NASA space program was shut down until questions were answered. And I'm thinking that the wisest thing to do now is to at least temporarily pause all future trips to the Titanic, especially tourist trips, until we have answers. How and why did this vessel fail?
Those questions will need to be asked and answered, as you've mentioned. You've had personal experience of an expedition just like this, being in a submersible, exploring the Titanic. Could you give our viewers a sense of what it involves, being in such a small space, 4,000 meters beneath the surface?
Yes, I received the invitation to go down in September of 2000. I didn't want to do it at first because I have a fear of water, but being the science editor at ABC News, I felt obligated to do it. And as a scientist, I was also interested in seeing the Titanic and reporting to the public about it. I thought it was a great opportunity to educate people on the Titanic. We took off from Halifax, Nova Scotia. The dive went very well, 2.5 hours to get down there. You were in cramp most of the time, well, all the time. I was laying on my stomach, looking out in about an 8-inch porthole. You don't see a whole lot, but that's how cramped it is. It's a 3-man sub, so it was me, a diving buddy, and the pilot in between. This is a Russian sub that was meant originally for scientific research, so it's very well built. It's been down there many, many times. When we collided with the propeller, obviously that was a terrifying experience. Pieces of the Titanic fell on us, and I knew immediately we were in crisis. Fortunately, our pilot, and this is what's very important, Julie and Steve, not only was this vessel well built and built for serious purpose, our pilot, Victor, he was a former Russian MiG pilot, so it was a man used to dealing with life and death situations, keeping his cool under pressure, and he managed after a half hour or so to get us out of disentangle us from the blades of the propeller. And I wouldn't be here talking with you this evening if it weren't for Victor's skills. That was very, very important. In contrast to that, Titan was designed for tourism. And there are legitimate questions to be asked as to whether this was genuinely seaworthy. Should it have been allowed to go down there? It made a couple of successful trips, so you might think, well, yes, but it has to make more than just 2 trips. The vessel I was on had made scores of trips. It's still in operation. These are 2 very famous submersibles the Russians have. I was in one of them.
You mentioned the life and death situation, and I understand you've explored the North and South Poles, reported on the Gulf War, other risky adventures. You must possess a remarkable capacity for handling fears. But when you found yourself trapped in a submersible thousands of meters deep, what was going through your mind?
At first, because I'm a scientist, so naturally I wanted to figure out a solution to our problem. That was just my go-to mode of operating. And then I quickly realized there was no viable way to escape, save for Victor's skills, which I didn't know would pay off at that point. I was facing a pretty bleak situation, and when I realized that there was no way out, I experienced enormous sadness, Julie. I thought of my wife. I'd never see her again. And then this voice came into my head, and I'll never forget it for the rest of my life. It said, "This is how it's going to end for you." And I did think of all the things that I had survived over the years. I had managed to survive them, but this was the end of the line. And then I experienced an enormous peace that I cannot explain, but it was something quite real to me. And then the sub went quiet, and that's when I discovered that Victor had managed to get us out of there. But it was a kind of a roller coaster of emotions. But I'll never forget that crushing sadness. I felt like the whole weight of the ocean that was just on my shoulders. I was basically buried alive at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It's not a pretty feeling.
Yeah, it's a very vulnerable situation to be in, for sure. Dr. Guillen, you're a journalist too. So with your journalist hat on, once this story broke on Sunday, that contact had been lost and the search had begun, what questions went through your mind and what concerns did you have?
Steve, almost immediately, when I heard that it had lost communications an hour and 40 some minutes into the dive, first of all, that told me immediately they never got to the bottom. It takes about 2.5 hours, 2 to 3 hours, depending on your rate of descent. So this is something that happened almost right at the get-go. That concerned me. And then what I found out, I know that the vehicle was designed so that the ballast that helps to weigh the ship down to help it go to the bottom was designed so that the ballast would be jettisoned after 24 hours, no matter what, whether the mission was successful or a failure. These were designed to jettison automatically. The fact that that didn't happen told me something else, that it was not just a communications failure. And they had two backup systems, an electrical one in case the automatic ballast release failed. They could push a button or a switch and release the ballast. That didn't work. And then there was even another backup. All that failing, they could have done it manually with a compressed air, pneumatically. They could have jettisoned the weights. The fact that none of those systems succeeded to bring them to the surface to safety told me immediately, Steve, that this was a catastrophic failure. And in all my reporting over the last 72 plus hours, I used that precise word. Interesting that the Rear Admiral used that precise word. It was pretty clear to me this was not just a communications failure. This was something that involved the entire vessel.
Dr. Guillen, not only Ocean Gate's Titan, but there are other companies offering these sort of submarine excursions. People enjoy them. What sort of impact do you think this incident would have on, the broader deep dive or in a submarine or extreme tourism industry as a whole?
Well, I think certainly for the Titanic, I do believe there should be a pause. I have a couple of concerns, Julie, regarding tourism. The idea of using the word tourism in connection with the Titanic, it bothers me for two reasons. Number one, the ocean is a very dangerous place. You don't mess with the ocean. It is restless and it is like a menace. It's like a beast that's ready to swallow you up if you make a single little mistake. So this is not a joyride to some Disneyland destination. This is involving, I don't care how much you want to spin it as recreation or tourism or not, you are dealing with the ocean. The ocean is unforgiving. That's number one. Number two, what I realized when I went down there and we had that moment of prayer, when we got to the bow at the beginning of the journey, we paused to give a moment of prayer for the people who lost their lives. More than 1,000 men, women, and children lost their lives there. I realized that this is not just a shipwreck. This is a grave site. This is sacred ground. This is their final resting place. So the idea that this is somehow a tourist destination bothers me for those two reasons. I think we should respect the danger of the mission, and we should also respect the fact that this is indeed the burial ground for more than 1,000 people who have been laid to rest there.
Dr. Guillen, we're going to have to leave it there for now, but thank you so much for your time and your unique experience and expertise in this story and being able to speak to us about it so eloquently. We do appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Michael Guillen.